This is further complicated by the fact that many sectors are funded by and significantly dependent on development partner support provided off budget. The cumulative effect of these dynamics is a system of fiscal decentralization in which finance has not really followed function, even though the principles of national decentralization policy have been consistently reiterated in most sector strategic plans since 1998, the share of local government expenditure has more than halved as a percentage of total government spending over the past 17 years. In turn, this has reinforced and deepened the capacity constraints facing local government officials who are tasked with carrying their service delivery responsibilities in the face of an often unreliable system of fiscal decentralization. So for meaningful deepening of decentralization to continue, the vicious cycle of low trust, low investment, low accountability in local governments needs to really be looked at again. Malawi's decentralization journey currently seems to have been stuck in a kind of a quagmire. Local government capacity constraints have historically served as a justification for retaining funds at the center or for significantly earmarking funds through conditional transfers, meaning in many instances, local governments are sometimes reduced to the role of implementing organs of the central government rather than governing agents in their own rights. Despite these challenges, there have been several meaningful policy choices in favor of decentralization over the past few years that present great opportunities to incentivize the improved delivery of services to citizens. And some of these include the 2014 reintroduction of elected local councillors. We now have local councillors that are elected. The introduction of the District Development Fund for the first time in 2016, providing discretionary development resources for councils to address local priorities. And then in 2017, there was the devolution of human resources.
Honorable Rebecca, can we conclude, please?
Yes, thank you. So quickly, UN is supporting Malawi in many ways. We are supporting them for data development, delivering as one at the decentralized level. We are also supporting integration across ministries and departments at the national and decentralized level. We've planned for this year to support data management systems and improve the local and urban development planning processes, oversight and delivery of services. So in conclusion, subsidiarity and decentralization, we know and say they both respect human dignity, which is important for sustainable development and peace, but they also promote inclusion. So if indeed no one is to be left behind, the principles of subsidiarity and sustainability and decentralization should be all of our guiding lights for accelerating achievement of the SDGs. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ms. Rebecca Ada Donto, for sharing with us the experience of Malawi, who is in fact one of our members in UCLG Africa. And she highlighted the fact, sorry, can you please, thank you. She highlights the fact that decentralization is among the national vision and strategy with the several institutional and legal arrangements, but still health and education are centralized in Malawi. Decentralized depends on funding from partners and also the issues of capacities, and she concludes with the support provided by UN system. Thank you very much. And now I have the honor to invite our second speaker. I am honored to introduce you, Mr. Dr. Bala Youssef Yunusa, who is the Senior Technical Advisor to the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Sustainable Development Goals. In this capacity, he provides technical leadership and strategic policy guidance in the overall implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Nigeria. Besides so many other achievements in his biography, he facilitated the adoption of the Millennium Villages model at the national level, reaching 21 million people across 113 local government areas. Bravo, Dr. Bala, and the floor is yours.
Merci. Thank you so much. And a very good afternoon from Abuja. I bring warm greetings from the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Sustainable Development Goals. And I appreciate the organizers of this strategic virtual meeting on subsidiarity and decentralization for sustainable development. Talking about multi-level governance. Following the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in September 2015, Nigeria acted very quickly in operationalizing the global goals. And Nigeria has a huge implementation context for the 2030 Agenda, and of course the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. We have a country of 923,000 square kilometers divided into 36 states, and the Federal Capital Territory, 774 local governments. And therefore, our strategic approach to the implementation of the SDGs can be seen at two different levels, at the national and at the subnational level. At the national level, we work closely. The Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on SDGs was established in 2016 as part of the institutional framework to guarantee effective implementation of the SDGs. And the office has fourfold mandate, that of strategic planning. Hello?
Yes, we are hearing you, Mr. Bala.
That of strategic planning, coordination and guidance, that of representation, advocacy and partnership building, that of resource mobilization and management, and finally, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting for the SDGs. So at the horizontal level, at the national level, the office works closely with the ministries, departments, and agencies, if you like, to integrate and mainstream the relevant SDGs into the sectoral policies and plans of the ministries, departments, and agencies. And we do that by institutionalizing frameworks that will support the implementation at the horizontal level. Now, talking about multi-level governance, the fiscal federalism empowered the 36 states and the local governments with 50% of the national resources. And therefore, power is naturally decentralized in Nigeria, and the 36 states are autonomous, and the 774 local governments are autonomous. Just like we have the national office coordinating the implementation of the SDGs as part of the multi-level governance for operationalizing the SDGs, all the 36 states have similar offices, either the Office of the Executive Governor on SDGs or the Office of the Special Advisor or Senior Special Assistant to the Governor on Sustainable Development Goals. And what we do is to enable, through the multi-level governance structure, is to empower, enable, capacitate the 36 states offices of the SDGs to, if you like, mainstream, integrate, and develop SDG-based medium and long-term development plans based on the development priorities and aspirations of the states. As we speak to you today, we have about 18 states on demand-driven basis that are at different stages of the development of their SDG-based development plans. About 7 of the states have completed either a 10-year, 15-year, or 25-even-year long-term SDG-based development plan that mainstream the Sustainable Development Goals into the plans of the states and by extension, that of the local governments. So the vertical coordination approach is that this office from the national is strengthening and supporting the 36 states and the FCT SDG offices to integrate, if you like, and mainstream the SDGs into their sector, into their medium and long-term development plans. So for us, our multi-level governance for the delivery of the SDGs has to follow our fiscal federalism as resources are fully devolved to the subnational level. As we speak to you today, when we conducted the first and the second voluntary national reviews, we conducted the reviews across the 36 states through the 6 geopolitical zones. We build capacity of the subnational governments on SDG mainstreaming and integration, as well as support, their ambitions to produce voluntary local reviews. At the moment, we have just completed the voluntary local reviews in 2 states in Nigeria, Lagos State in Southwest, as well as Kaduna State in the Northwest. And more states are beginning to, in line with their SDG-based development planning, are committed, if you like, to conducting voluntary local reviews of the Sustainable Development Goals. This, we believe, is an appropriate institutional framework to support multi-level governance in a way that concept of subsidiarity and decentralization enables us to operationalize the Sustainable Development Goals. These offices, for example, the office at the national level, it's well capacitated with resources, with the appropriate political commitment right in the office of the president to provide horizontal and vertical intergovernmental planning and coordination for the Sustainable Development Goals. It is important to highlight, like I earlier mentioned, the fiscal, the federal system will operate, enable this multi-level governance structure or framework for the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals to happen. For the sake of time, I am 7 minutes on the dot, and I would like to stop and thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to a productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bala, for sharing with us, I guess, a unique federal system in Africa, highlighting the horizontal and vertical perspective, which give a sense to the fiscal decentralization in Nigeria. And I also highlight the political commitment and the appropriate means given to your office to meet your mandate and agenda. Now, thank you very much, Professor Bala. We will have our third speaker. Let me introduce to you Mr. Tebogo Matlow. He's a project manager, international programs and partnership within South Africa Local Government Association, SALGA, in South Africa. Let me just share with you his impressive biography. And he, by the way, he's one of my colleagues. SALGA is a member of UCLG Africa and a powerful one. So Professor Tebogo has worked for SALGA for 18 years as an analyst. And also during his impressive career, he has won several awards at the best employee at Mopani FET College and SALGA, including Team of the Year for making impact through building inclusive green municipality projects. Current interests are for him are sustainable development goals, asset management, environmental sustainability, lastly, leadership, powerful influence, and political in project management. Professor Tebogo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My apology, I have a flu. However, I will try by all means to to represent. Can I share my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, not yet. You can share your screen, please.
Mr. Tebogo, you can do it now.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, if you can. Yeah, now it's good.
Yeah, I won't dwell much on this because I'm going to share the presentation. But we are aware we are dealing with SDGs, and the baseline is that in South Africa we had only City of Cape Town that represented us in 2019. However, as an organization, we took an initiative to support our members to write voluntary local reviews. But at the high level, the country has been reporting on SDGs, and then we submitted our proposal to UNDP, UNDESA to also support us on these initiatives. What we did, we took bigger cities to come and work with us. Buffalo City, eThekwini, City of Tshwane, and City of Johannesburg. Those were the biggest cities out of the 8 to participate in the program. But this is how we are.
Professor, excuse me, Professor. There is
Can you hear me?
there is something which disturbed your intervention.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we are hearing you. Please.
Yeah, so we have 3 spheres of government: local government, provincial government, and national government. One of the things that we raised was that everything happens at local government. You can't exclude all of us. So this is how we are. Probably, we've got 8 metros, 44 districts, 205 local municipalities. Just look at from that, we only took 8 to work with us based on our intergovernmental relations framework, which designed to facilitate cooperation and coordination amongst the different spheres of government, nationally, provincially, and local. So in our sessions that we started by having 5 of the cities that are working with us, including City of Cape Town, to start to work with us. But what we did, we selected municipalities from different spheres when we started the program to create awareness, mobilize and commit public and local government to the construction of fair and sustainable cities. But bear in mind, we've got challenges against SDG number 5 and number 10 regarding inequalities and promoting of human rights and social control under SDG number 16. But this is where we are. This is where we are with subsidiarity. I'm not gonna go through it because these are the things that, as a country, we are supposed to be working on, like providing democratic accountable government for local communities and provide social and economic development. The key one is that we need a healthy nation to work on that. But Du Plessis distinguish between the subsidiarity and institutional subsidiarities. But here are the challenges, as I was given to respond to. The democratic decentralization was started, also supported by UCLG, to redress apartheid legacies and chart a participatory developmental path. Yes, we've got an IDP, which is called Integrated Development Plan, where municipalities are engaging communities. However, there's unequal distribution of the means of production and infrastructure power. If you follow us, most of the time, excuse me, you find that if there's a service delivery strike, residents are marching, but they also destroy the property. But these are the issues that we are also working on. The political resistance, Madam Chair, is something that, due to concern about losing control over resources, they end up not decentralizing some of the work for local government to do its own work. And I was telling Treasury the other time, you can't celebrate taking money from local government because we are the core phase of service delivery to ensure that we support that. The vision of decentralization has not been translated into corporate reality in municipalities, but we are getting there through this program so that we are able to support municipalities. The capacity issue, it's one of the key issues. When we started the program, Madam Chair, we had a challenge of getting people that understand why should we do sustainable development goal, and so that we reach the goal of 2030. But we realized that most of them didn't have a capacity to work on this. So it's gonna take us sometimes, even though we were left with less than 7 years to do this work. But there's a thing that you start by sharpening the blade. By the time it's tried to chop, it will also be able to do its part. This lack of capacity, Madam Chair, it's also through affecting municipalities through planning. And we were saying we need to focus more on SDG number 11, but look at how it's related to other SDGs, because the colleague that I supported wanted to do all of them. We said, no, let's see if there is synergy between other SDGs, because you can't run SDG number 11 without 6, without 7, without 9, without 16, and 13 and 17. However, when you do everything, you are responding to SDG number 1, no poverty. So one of the other things, Chair, is lack of fund to local sphere responsibilities. It came to them as an unfunded mandate. So part of our opportunities that we talk about is that we really need to have a way to ensure that municipalities are also budgeting for this work through our lobbying processes. The political administrative interference has limited the ability of municipalities to carry out their duties and provide the goods and services for voters. One of the key things that I think all of us were struggling with is lack of data to accelerate SDG. I think all of us we were struggling with that, but we engage stats. They are working with us as other partners, and we're saying this project, it's all about partnership within a partnership of the partnership to ensure that we accelerate the SDGs. There are other things that is also affecting us, Madam Chair, and the people at large, is that we are experiencing municipal coalitions, and that is also affecting us to be able to align the integrated development plans with SDGs. So we need time to show them how this thing is happening. One of the issues is corruption, which we need to address as a country by strengthening anti-corruption measures and promoting good governance. So we're working with Michael and Colin in our program of voluntary local reviews to strengthen that part. Lack of accountability is one of the things. Ethics and tribal dynamics are those. Decentralization, which should be a restorative measures for administrative functionally. We have Auditor General normally who audit our municipalities so that they are able to get a good governance on their work. The challenge for national and government is to implement this decentralization as a measures in a temporary but strategic and purposeful manner. But we realize that it could change service delivery and perspectives on decentralization. But our constitution is clear. I'm not gonna go to that. What we pick it up is that nearly half of our municipalities do also not have engineers on their staff. But this is a key that we need to ensure that at least to a national and provincially decentralize some of the work. We put these people in our municipalities because asset management is very key for service delivery and for climate change issues, because you should be able to respond to or be resilient to what we put. Another issue that hamper local government, it's a amount of legislation that complicates and governs local government, because it's everybody's sphere and it's becoming too complex.
Can we conclude, dear Professor, please?
Yes, we developed this for our municipalities. We call it Salga SDG Hub Centric. It's live now. These are the municipalities that we are supporting, but this is how we align IDP goals and objectives with our municipalities. This is what we did so that they can be aware of what is happening. But value to municipalities, new opportunities for funding. It presents a practical, useful agenda for political and administrative leaders in municipalities. But it's a new culture of partnership between municipal administration. What we did is that we are now seeing municipalities start to work together, Madam Chair. So the other value is that we are doing this to promote regional development and resolving some of the conflict within our sector. Madam Chair, this is where we're going. What we are going to do is that we are also going to work with UN Habitat to start a National Urban Planning Forum to deal with issues that are focusing on SDG number 11, 9, 13, 16, 17. But leave no one behind, Madam Chair. Focus on the gender issues because they are very key. Awareness is what we are doing at Salga. When we're playing the World Cup, we had this awareness campaign, promotional material, and the soccer ball. There's Clarissa was coordinating the project on behalf of SALGA when we work. So, Madam Chair, thank you very much. No one knows everything. Everyone knows something. All knowledge resides in network. And SDG network like this one, it's where municipalities and all of us are learning on how to ensure that at least we achieve the 2030 target. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, Professor Tibego, for sharing with us the main challenge faced by the local government in South Africa. And I noticed the political resistance, the capacities, the lack of resources, and the inflation of legal instruments. And it's not limited to South Africa, it's an African issue. The issue of accountability also is very important. And you share with us some best practices, including how you're supporting the local government, provincial government in the voluntary local review and voluntary subnational review. It was also highlighted by Professor Bala. Thank you very much. With this presentation, we will move to the last speaker for this segment. We will shift our perspective to the efforts in the region with our fourth guest speaker, namely Mr. Isaka Garba Abdu, who is the head governance and human rights division, Directorate for Governance and Conflict Prevention, African Union Commission. Mr. Isaka Garba has occupied various other positions as a senior political officer within African Union. And also we used to collaborate with him. Thank you, Mr. Isaka, for being here, and the floor is yours. Your mic, please, Isaka. Activate your mic, please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Madam Moderator, for giving me the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. African Union is honored to intervene at this very important event. From the African Union perspective, so decentralization and also subsidiarity and all the principles of subsidiarity are at the heart of the African Union mandate. And this can be seen through the role that the Agenda 2063 place, focus on the implication of local authority, the community, and also it's people-centered. And also when you look at the African Charter, the decision by head of state and government to create, to adopt the African Charter on value and principle of of decentralization of local local governance and local development. It is a key message on the ambition or the intention of the AU willing to promote, protect, and act as a catalyst for decentralization, and also to promote and champion local governance and local democracy as one of the cornerstones of the decentralization in Africa. And also the Charter seeks to also promote resource mobilization, local economic development with the view to eradicate poverty in Africa, and also to promote the shared understanding of a common vision of the member state on the matter related to decentralization, local governance, and local development. One other decision, important decision, is also coming from the head of state to create an African Union High Council of Local Authority to promote local community participation to the decision-making process at the African Union level. So these are at the regional level, how this principle of subsidiarity and decentralization is very important for the African Union. And the African Union also facilitating partnership between member states to share best practices and resources for effective decentralization. So when we talk about best practices, it's important here to highlight some key best practices on the continent. You know, when you look at Rwanda local governance and healthcare improvement has made a significant strident in improving healthcare access through decentralization. The government has empowered local health management team and also community health workers that have been key in increasing healthcare coverage at the grassroots level. This has contributed to Rwanda's progress in achieving SDG 3, good health and well-being, with marked reduction in child mortality and improvement of maternity health. When you look at also Morocco solar power decentralization, for example, we call it Morocco Noor Ouarzazate complex, is one of the world's largest solar plant, which is part of national strategy to harness solar energy. And decentralization has been crucial in this project, with local authorities playing a significant role and in land allocation and also the project management contribution to SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, and SDG 13, climate action. And also one third point also is Kenya devolution and the local development, local economic development, which is a form of political decentralization that has brought government closer to the people, with counties now having the power and resources to drive local economic development. So as we don't have enough time, I don't have enough time, I will highlight some key challenges. For sure, we have challenges in the sense of absence of bringing decision-making process closer to the beneficiaries, as well as also the responsiveness and the effectiveness of the service that is delivered. So when you look at also some major global trends such as urbanization, climate change, and technology advancement, they have also some kind of potential impact on decentralization of local governance, in the sense that the absence of resources and the lack of capacity to accompany local community to address these challenges is also an issue. And we have also other challenges like the elite dominance in certain cases, and also the limited administrative expertise as key hurdles in subsidiarity and decentralization. Now we can have some recommendation like innovative approach.
Can we please, dear Isaka, can we please conclude?
Okay, just to conclude on the recommendation, innovative approach, I think, and technology could support more effective local governance, such as digital platform for participatory decision-making process, and the implementation of transparency, accountability, and community monitoring to reduce risk in decentralized governance. I can stop here, and I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isaka, for your speech about the African Union perspective, and you share with us some of the legal instruments adopted, implemented by African Union member states. Also working on resource mobilization, which is very important. You also shared some best practices coming from Rwanda for healthcare, from Morocco for solar plan, and from Kenya, the local economic development at county levels. And you conclude by sharing with us some challenge, and I noticed the elite dominant, and also you suggest that we focus on technology, participatory approach, and also fighting corruption and investing in transparency. Thank you very much, Mr. Isaka, for your presence and your speech. With this presentation, we have finished the first part of our, the first segment of our agenda. And I will ask for the help of Praben or Anna, if there is any questions, comments from our audience, and which speaker they are targeting, please. If there is, I can take one or two. Any questions?
Yes,
Anna?
they are. Yes, there are some questions for the speakers. Some has been responded, Ms. Najat. I think maybe we can you can take maybe one of them. Let me find out for the representative of Nigeria. I'll send it to you.
Yes, I have it. So this is for Professor Bala, to the representative of Nigeria. What are you doing to keep girls and women safe in the country? SDG 5 Target 2.1 states that all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and other types of exploitation, must be eliminated. Professor Bala, feedback?
Thank you so much. Just like this question, it's unfortunate. I mean, the situation we are, it's quite unfortunate. Yeah, we have insecurity challenges undermining progress towards the achievements of the entire SDG, not only SDG 8. Yeah, there are pockets of kidnappings, school children across, especially the northeast and northwestern parts of Nigeria. But this is a security challenge that the security agencies are doing everything humanly possible. The president has given orders to the military authorities to make sure that this insecurity is brought to an end, so that people can enjoy peace and prosperity across the country. This is what I would say for now. I lead the technical coordination of the implementation of the SDGs, and these are strictly security challenges. And like I've said, the government is it's doing everything humanly possible to make sure that children, girls, women are safe wherever they are, whether in school or in the communities. Otherwise, the SDGs cannot be achieved in a situation of insecurity. And we all know the relationship also between security and national development. Thank you.
Very much, Honorable Professor Bala. Do we have time to take one more question?
Unfortunately not.
Okay, so thank you very much to our speakers for the first segment of our agenda. And now we will move to the second one about strategies to operationalize the principle of subsidiarity. We will move then to our speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Patrick Spearin, Secretary of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, to deliver a brief introduction of the guidance notes. And allow me to highlight the fact that Patrick, he has served in positions at the United Nations supporting multi-stakeholders consultation and deliberation. He was also the departmental focal point on governance within the UN system task team convened in the lead up to the 2030 agenda. And we used to rely on his support during our work, all our work in the SIPA. Thank you, Patrick, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and of course, always a pleasure to see you and other colleagues. I'll be very quick since time is short, and I'm sure you want to leave enough room for the interactive discussion at the end between the experts and the other participants. So some participants may be wondering where these so-called strategies or practice areas come from under the principle of subsidiarity. And I can say quite simply that they are not out of the air. They come from various UN treaties, resolutions, and commitments adopted over many years. So the point of these guidance notes and the engagement of the expert consultants is to try to put some flesh on the operationalization of these particular practice areas. The set of strategies, fiscal federalism and decentralization, strengthening municipal finance, strengthening urban governance, and so on, are not exhaustive. There are other ways of thinking about subsidiarity and decentralization, obviously, but we hope that they provide a solid foundation for making progress on strengthening subnational authorities and intergovernmental relations. They also are not a checklist of things that countries have to be doing. None of the principles or the strategies that are associated with those principles are a must do necessarily, but depend a lot on the priorities of a country and subnational authorities and the particular context. And we've heard about some of the issues that are faced by countries such as Malawi, Nigeria, South Africa, by the African continent in general, and others, as highlighted in the chat, having to do with building up subnational authorities in the context of peace building, conflict prevention, questions of inclusion, and also in relation to specific sectoral issues having to do with education, health, housing, infrastructure, inequalities, public safety, livelihoods, corruption. The list goes on. We've heard many of these examples already in the discussion. So in the guidance notes that will be presented by the experts, you'll hear about what these strategies are, what the current situation is in the public sector, how to go about implementing them, where there are opportunities for peer learning, where there are opportunities for engaging with international development partners, and maybe some case examples to highlight what is being discussed in the notes. We hope very much that you find the work helpful in thinking about concrete and action-oriented initiatives that can move the needle forward on the achievement of national sustainable development objectives. And we also want to point out that this principle of subsidiarity is part of a larger set of principles, a larger framework of effective governance for sustainable development, as mentioned at the beginning. And you can find out more about this larger framework of effective governance, dealing with questions of effectiveness, accountability, and so on. Within which subsidiarity is situated by looking at our website, and we're happy to help you find the material if you need. I finally want to acknowledge the excellent work of these experts who are going to present today, and really thank them profoundly for the contribution that they've made to thinking about these issues and to helping countries advance on the subsidiarity for sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your insightful introduction. We have indeed 5 experts presentation. So let us start with the first speaker and expert, Professor Paul Smoke, who is Professor Public Finance and Planning at Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Service in New York University. Professor Paul teaches courses on public finance, development planning, governance, and development assistance in developing countries. And he serves on the Economic Advisory Council of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the Advisory Board of the Local Public Sector Alliance. Professor Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello to everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. My presentation is a bit of an overview, and then some of the people who follow me will go into a bit more detail. I'm particularly pleased to be with you today because Africa is the area that I have worked in a lot. My own work has concentrated on, and I actually have lived and worked in Africa before I got into academia. So I'm doing the overview on fiscal federalism and decentralization, and we've already gone through, I think, the fact that decentralization's been very important, and the previous speakers and Patrick also emphasized that low and middle income countries have pursued decentralization for a variety of reasons. So I won't go through all of these, but the basic idea behind subsidiarity is that achieving any of these goals is based on the expected greater subnational knowledge of local conditions and needs and their closer connection to local people compared to central government. A big piece of the rationale for decentralization and subsidiarity is a public finance theory known as fiscal federalism, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, this looks like it might be a complicated chart, but it's not really. The theory of public finance is about what is the role of government in the economy to help stabilize and redistribute resources, but also to deliver services, to meet public functions. And this is the principle of subsidiarity basically says that, as we've already heard, that these functions should go to the lowest possible subnational level. And so what fiscal federalism does is it lays out a set of principles for us to think about what functions should be assigned to various levels of government, what finances do they need to provide those functions, and in what ways might they interact with the private sector. And so the basic fiscal federalism model is economic principles. It's textbook principles. And they get us in the right direction to think about what local government should do. But as we've heard very clearly from the previous speakers, the political and institutional context is what really determines this. And so the principles are used to say, what are local functions? And then one of the golden rules of fiscal federalism is finance follows function. So once you determine what the responsibilities are, then you have to make sure that they have the finances to provide those services. And these can be local revenues like property taxes. They can be transfers that support the general revenue base of subnational governments, but also help meet other national goals for certain priorities that are important. They're local services, but they have a larger impact on the whole country. And also, transfers can be used to redistribute resources to poorer places that can't raise their own revenues. And for infrastructure development, particularly in bigger cities under the right conditions, you might be able to borrow or have private sector financing. So we don't have time to go through the principles, but this is basically what the paper outlines. And I wanted to highlight just a few points about this. The elements of fiscal federalism obviously need to be integrated. So again, if you ask local governments to provide a service, you have to make sure they have the revenue. But there are also ways in which the other elements can interact with what the local governments do. So for example, one of the problems that people complain about with intergovernmental transfers is that if the national government is giving resources to richer cities, then those cities might not want to collect the local revenue that they're legally allowed to collect. And it means that places that don't need to be subsidized as much are being subsidized at the expense of the poorer places that cannot raise their own revenue. So these elements are integrated. And this last point, beyond the physical elements, as we've seen from what the previous speakers said, that effective fiscal decentralization depends on administrative and political decentralization. There have to be the powers to plan, to budget, to manage, and they have to have the autonomy through political decentralization for the local governments to be able to meet the needs of the local people. And this is just a table you can look at another time, but basically it just shows that subnational government expenditures and revenues as a share of GDP and total expenditures and revenues are lower, and particularly low in the lowest developing countries, the lowest income developing countries compared to the higher income. And so obviously an important role of fiscal decentralization is to try to increase this role for the countries in the lower income categories. Now, just a few last things before I wrap up and we move on to others. As again, I think has been demonstrated by the previous speakers, there is no best assignment of subnational government functions and revenues. The principles tell you what you ought to be thinking about, but the fiscal federalism principles have to be compatible with economic, institutional, political, and cultural contexts, both across countries and within countries, because there are differences within countries. And we've already talked about, the previous speakers have highlighted, I think, quite well, a lot of the common implementation challenges. Maybe not so much the economic realities where local governments may have limited or narrow economic bases and be faced with pervasive poverty. But I think there have been plenty of examples given about the lack of good information to design and manage systems and the lack of empirical evidence regarding what actually works. And then the capacity constraints and political realities, I think, have been well covered. So I want to close by saying the problem with using fiscal federalism is that what the principles will tell you is a system that's over here, and what many countries have, whether they're already legally decentralized or not, is over here. And the distance between what the principles tell you should happen and where you are now is large. And so you cannot do it all at once. And something that I think is deeply neglected in the application of fiscal federalism is strategic implementation. What are the appropriate starting points, and how do you sequence reforms to get to where you want to go? How do you use piloting and experimentation before mainstreaming reform design? Often, I think, especially in cases where international donors are involved, you have experts coming in using the principles to tell you what you ought to do. Test it before you use it, and then scale it up. How do you create incentives for everyone to adopt reforms? Under decentralization, national government ministries have to behave differently. They have to have more trust and give more authority to local governments. And local governments have to take that authority and be accountable to their people. How do we use the strategy to enhance capacity development for the things that are going on right now? And how do we change? One of the big problems with decentralization programs in many countries is that there's a program and everybody says we have to stick to it. But if you find that there are mistakes, change it, fix it. And how do you work effectively with international development partners interested in providing support? In many cases, the international development partners are pushing somewhat different things. And ultimately, it's the responsibility of the country to figure out how to use fiscal federalism, how to use fiscal decentralization in a way that works for them. And the international development partners have to support that. And I think that is it. Happy to take any questions from people over email or however you want to try to find me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Smoke, for your clear presentation about the fiscal federalism and decentralization. And I noticed the necessity to have a credible intergovernmental fiscal system. And to assure an effective fiscal decentralization, we need a concrete local autonomy, meaning an appropriate administrative, political, and institutional decentralization. You noticed also there is less fiscal decentralization in middle and low income countries, and the national context is crucial. You highlight some challenge like the economic and political realities, the lack of data, the weaknesses in technical, managerial, and governance capacities, and you advocate for a strategic implementation strategies backed by capacity development. And I will add the political will and also the mindset change and transformative leadership at all levels of governance. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite our second speaker, Professor Astrid Haas, urban economist and adjunct professor at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. Professor is an independent urban economist working in both research and practice, supporting cities around strategy generally and specifically to strengthen their financial system with a focus on unleashing new opportunities for subnational financing. Professor Astrid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
After all these Zoom conversations, I still don't find the mute button. So many thanks, Najat, for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be able to go after Paul because he provided the framework in which now I'm going to sort of try and flesh it out, caveated that we don't have a lot of time. So I encourage everyone to go to the guidance note that is written on this on strengthening municipal and local finance systems, where much more detail is provided. I think, next slide, please. So underpinning everything that we've talked about and all the previous speakers in terms of achieving SDGs, achieving the localization of SDGs, is money. We need the financing at a local level to be able to implement, to be able to develop. And underpinning a local finance system is sound public financial management. Now, within the guidance note, we go through some sort of very basic structures that you see here on the screen of what is core to strengthening local and financial management systems in each of these areas. So I'm going to now briefly go through each one in turn, but again, encouraging you to actually go to the guidance note to see more details as well as case study examples. Next slide, please. So Paul mentioned that finance should follow function. Even before that, there needs to be a vision. The local government or whoever is setting the budget needs to have a plan. It needs to be able to understand what its priorities are for investments over a medium to longer period of time. This is because resources are constrained, and so trade-offs need to be made. And a credible way of doing this is through capital investment planning, which is essentially just a list of prioritized projects for investments. It helps local governments, local municipal governments be able to, as I said, prioritize what they want to spend on. It helps provide cost projections, so understanding then what you need to spend and therefore what you need to be raised. What you need to raise. It understands if you're borrowing what your fiscal space is, i.e. how much you've borrowed and how much you need to repay over time. And importantly, now a lot of capital investment plans also look at climate smart alternatives. So you can build in climate considerations right into the plan. Beyond being an important strategy document for local and municipal governments, this is also a credible signal to investors that your priorities won't change. So if investors want to lend you money over a longer term, they want to understand that as a local and municipal government, this is indeed your priority over the medium to long term, and therefore the repayment will happen. So this capital investment plan is both key as an internal planning document, but as well as an external credibility marker. Next slide, please. Once the vision is there, once the priorities have been set, then the question is how to finance and fund the priorities and operationalize them. And that's where the budget comes in. Now, budget cycle processes will necessarily be context specific. Different countries will have different rules on when and how the budget cycle happens, and also what role local and municipal governments will play within that budget cycle. In general, the more decentralized the country, the stronger the role will be for the municipal and or local government to play in terms of setting their budget. But overall, there will always be a role, and the budget cycle will generally or should generally follow these 4 stages. So a strategic stage where it's important to get stakeholder input, and that's stakeholders beyond government, so also from constituencies, and this helps set the target. So budgeting is usually done annually for the year. a needs assessment. So how much money is needed? How much money are we going to raise? And what's going to be the capital and operating budget, which I'll come to shortly. A review by necessary stakeholders and approvals. And finally, the implementation. But with the implementation, it's also really important to have a strong monitoring and evaluation mechanism to be able to assess how you've met your targets, where maybe you've failed to meet your targets, and therefore maybe where you need to adjust for future budgeting cycles. Next slide, please. And the budget is obviously made up of various components. The one that we generally, and I work with a lot of city governments, the one that we generally like to talk about is how we raise the money. So where the money is going to come from. Again, revenue assignments are going to be allocated differently depending on various factors, including the level of decentralization. And Paul spoke about that briefly in his previous presentation. But particularly when we talk about, best practices in revenue assignments, it's about how we can make sure that we raise money at the most suitable level of government. And so some examples are given here. Sorry, Najat, I see you. I don't know whether that means my time is nearly up, so maybe I should speed up. Next slide, please. Transfers, as has been discussed, make up a large part of own source revenues. This is not necessarily a bad thing. However, as Honorable Rebecca mentioned before, it can constrain local governments if transfers have too many conditionalities attached to them. So thinking about how transfer policy is also an indication that local and national governments need to work together in terms of local and municipal finance systems. Next slide, please. Importantly for local governments is where they can raise money themselves, because this tends to be the money that they are able to allocate for their own needs and resources. There's various ways local governments can raise money. Perhaps the most important one is property and land tax. I don't have any time to go into this in further detail. There has been a lot written about this, and I urge for those who have not encountered the benefits of this tax to go into it. But this is perhaps one of the most important yet underutilized taxes for most local governments around the world, and has a lot of potential with administrative reforms to increase revenues. Sorry, I'm speeding through this in the interest of time, but again, more detail to be found in the guidance note. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's also user fees. User fees are an important source of revenue that local governments don't tend to like to use because people complain about having to pay for services. But local governments have to cover their costs. Everything comes with a cost. Providing services comes with a cost. And so when setting user fees, it's important to think about meeting the cost of providing that service, but also taking into account things like affordability, particularly for more marginalized and vulnerable populations. So user fees are, again, an important, yet particularly in the African context, underutilized source of potential revenue, but obviously should be set and used with caution to what local populations can afford, and so need to ensure that they can continue to meet their needs. Next slide, please. On the other side of the equation is the expenditures. This is the functions that Paul was talking about. These again will be determined by legislation. Important here is to think about capital expenditures. So these are the expenditures you're making into long-term infrastructure and development, and recurrent expenditures you need to make on a reoccurring basis. And a lot of, in African contexts, a lot of recurrent expenditures are used to cover wage and salary costs. In general, we want to shift the expenditure profile to take into account more long-term spending and capital expenditures, because this is what drives productivity and development.
Dear Astrid,
yes, I shall wrap up shortly.
Minutes, please.
Sure. Yeah, please. Next slide. And then finally, there's borrowing. But borrowing is really comes at the end of once you've sort of strengthened your revenue systems, and is highly constrained for most African local governments, both as a result of legislation, but also creditworthiness. So a lot can be done around this. And I know UCLG, for example, is one organization that is looking into this. Next slide. Finally, local governments have a lot of assets, and these are not usually considered, particularly land. And so creating an asset register is a really important way of strengthening budget and financial systems. And this is really reflects the overall public wealth, but is also then what you can use if you can borrow, what you can also borrow against. So assets should be considered, but are usually forgotten as part of a public financial management system. And I think the next slide is the final slide. But just to say, all of this is very dependent on the social contract. So if you're going to do strong public financial management, it has to be also visible to those who are paying taxes and user fees for them to be able to comply. And this can unleash a positive cycle and through this strengthen local and municipal financial systems. So let me leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Astrid, for this presentation that has focused on the link between, and I appreciate it, between the social contract and the capital investment plan, the necessity to set local priorities, and this is really the most important problem and weaknesses at local level. In rapid urbanization and also extensive decentralization movement, we need to invest more and more in funding and financing the vision, the plans, the budget of the local government. She also did a mapping of what we mean by the resources, the revenues, the expenditures, and the asset of local governments. And sometimes they don't have an idea about all these elements. So we need really to multiply more and more events like the one we have today. Thank you very much. And now we are moving to our next speaker. I would like to invite Professor Anna Pleider, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London, to deliver her presentation. Professor Anna research and teaching interests center on comparative political economy with a particular focus on transformation of the welfare state and their impact on patterns of inequality. More specifically, she studied the effect of decentralization reforms on territorial inequalities. Professor Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for this lovely introduction. It's hard to follow up such good presentations that came before me, but I'll try my best. So I will elaborate on a concept that is perhaps a little more unheard of than decentralization, which is multi-level governance. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So essentially, multi-level governance is a term or field of study developed to understand multiple authority shifts away from the national level. Those can be shifts upwards to international organizations such as the United Nations, but also downward shift to regional tiers or local tiers. And we know that these shifts have been increasing ever since the end of the Second World War because of various political processes such as democratization. So we can define the term as essentially a system of governance where shares are distributed or tasks are distributed across these different tiers. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, a key question here is why have countries moved towards this seemingly more complex way of organizing governance or government, or why should governments move towards this in the future? Well, the key benefit of a multi-level governance system is what we call scale flexibility. And it has been touched upon a little bit by the earlier presentations already. And it just means that it allows the level of governance to be adjusted to the exact territorial scale at which a particular policy is most efficiently provided. So some policies might be better provided at the central level or even international level if we think environmental protection, if we think building a resilient infrastructure, all of which are sustainable development goals. But other goods are clearly more efficiently provided at the local level. And that is particularly the case when preferences vary sharply across regions within a country. And local governments are more apt at summarizing these diverse preferences and at expressing these diverse preferences. And actually, relating to my other field of study, which is social policy, it's particularly in those areas like social policy, healthcare, education, that involve a face-to-face delivery, where local governments are particularly good at summarizing preferences and at tailoring the delivery to local preferences. And I'll add one last point, just because it's particularly relevant to multi-ethnic countries and multi-ethnic societies. Multi-level governance has actually been shown to help preserve peace in multi-ethnic societies, as it first of all allows the expression of these diverse preferences, and it allows diversity among linguistic and cultural groups by giving them some autonomy, and thereby giving them the sense of being protected from the abuse of central authority. Now, obviously, multi-level governance or decentralization also is associated with a number of risks. And one of those is that it increases transaction costs of coordinating across these multiple jurisdictions. And there's extra administrative overheads involved in generating multiple jurisdictions. And these transaction costs only ever increase or can be blown out of proportion if there are additional political and partisan dynamics that come into play where ideology differs across different levels and can lead to quite conflictual relations. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about current public sector trends and what's going on, it's important to highlight that there's a lot of variation in the way countries have structured their multi-level systems. There's no one size fits all. But what it generally helps is to think about this variation in terms of two distinct properties of these systems. One refers to sort of what I call the centralization-decentralization dimension, which is where in a system is authority of a particular policies located? Is it more at the local level, more at the regional level, more at the national level? But a second very important property is what I call the autonomy interdependence dimension. This is not where is authority located, but how do levels relate to one another? And the key aspect here is the system mostly emphasizing autonomous spheres of action where the different levels act independently of one another, autonomously, or does it create high levels of interdependence where the levels are mutually dependent on one another? And that is usually the result of sharing legislative competencies over the same policy area, or the result of assigning legislative authority to one level, but implementation to another level, which can also create this high level of interdependence. And next slide, please. And so if we think about the consequences for multi-level governance for policymaking, it's actually a function of how these two different properties are combined, right? So we can have a highly decentralized country like Canada, where actually the spheres are largely autonomous. They act in sort of watertight compartments. And that creates the absolute maximum decision-making leeway at the subnational level, which can be positive as it invites like experimentation and competition, etc., but which can also create quite high levels of territorial inequality. In Germany, we have the combination of a very decentralized system with very high levels of interdependence, so where a lot of tasks are shared. Now, that restricts a little bit the decision-making leeway, but also it really increases the transaction costs, right? So not coordinating or not cooperating in systems that emphasize interdependence is very costly and can lead to high problems. South Africa is a very interesting case because it also seeks to emphasize interdependence and is not quite as decentralized, but they're seeing some of the similar dynamics in South Africa as well. Next slide, please. So if we think about how to implement these systems and what kind of practical advice we can give to implement, well, if we think about the first property, so where should we locate authority in a multi-level system? Well, we should ideally assign the functions to the territorial level where they're most efficiently provided. And so Paul has given us a couple of ideas of where that might be, but generally, policies that benefit from economies of scale should be higher up the territorial ladder. Policies that benefit from these, from being able to express diversity in preferences should go lower down the ladder. There are political aspects that go into these considerations as well. I just wanted to highlight 3 measures through which we can change sort of where authority is allocated, which is a little bit more practical. So typically, changes in the allocation of authority require new legislation to be passed. But short of overhauling a whole constitution, we can think about temporary contracts between levels of governments, where for temporary or short amount of time, some tasks are assigned to a different level of government, either upwards or downwards. A third interesting way of changing the allocation of authority is to think about creating jurisdictions that are task specific. So typically that involves several local or regional authorities coming together, joining forces and creating a new task-specific jurisdiction. And the idea is that basically this jurisdiction has flexible territorial boundaries that can be adapted to the policy problem at hand. So typically we see that with transport authorities that cross over several local governments and that are basically ring fencing a particular transport problem. We also see it with airport authorities or certain public resource authorities as well. So that is a way of scaling up or going up the territorial scale without necessarily changing legislation. One thing I want to pick up on that has been mentioned in the previous panel regarding the case of South Africa is capacity building. So obviously, scaling up or down the territorial scale doesn't just mean giving authority to a new level of government. It also means ensuring that that level of government has sufficient capacity to carry these responsibilities out. And that can involve fiscal resources, and both Astrid and Paul talked about the fiscal aspect. But sometimes capacity challenges are not just limited to fiscal resources, but also to just human resource issues. Is there the skill available at the local and regional level to carry out these resources? Is there enough knowledge? Is there enough experience at these different levels? Next slide, please. This is my last slide, which relates to the implementation challenges related to the second property, which is how do levels relate? And the challenges related to that typically are greater the more interdependence there already is. And those systems that have created a lot of interdependence by sharing different tasks, for instance, benefit hugely from setting up coordinating bodies. And those coordinating bodies help manage that mutual dependence. And one such body, for instance, is the setting up of meetings between executive level representatives from regions and representatives from central or national governments. And those meetings should be routinized.
Professor Anna, is the last slide?
It's the last slide.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you.
And those meetings should be routinized and help joint decision-making which is really useful, especially if both central and subnational governments disagree on certain matters and if things become a little bit conflictual. So those meetings can really help solve interdependence issues and help invite collaboration. Not all coordinating bodies need to be as high profile or as formalized. There can be less high profile coordinating bodies such as working forces or task forces, or even specific government agencies and offices that really aim at helping different levels find a consensus. So this was my last slide on implementation challenges related to the second property, and I hope you find some of these points useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanna, for clarifying the concept of multi-level governance from local to subnational level, which of course impact the responsibilities, the decision-making process. I noticed also the cost of having multi-level governance system versus flexibility. She highlighted also the challenge and risk, like the partisan and the ideological differences between the different levels of governance. I may add the instability of such change with periodical change in African countries, especially during this current period. She analyzes also the consequences for the policy making and decision making mechanism between these two options, centralization versus decentralization, autonomy versus interdependence. And maybe allow me to add a third one is the dilution of responsibilities sometimes. So she insists on capacity building and also the efficiency of coordination bodies. Thank you very much, Professor Hanna. And now I invite our, I have the honor to invite our fourth speaker, Professor Alan Lavelle. Professor Alan is a research associate at the Latin American Social Faculty, Costa Rica, and founding member of the Latin American Network for the Social Study for Disaster Prevention, to deliver a presentation on his guidance. And allow me also to add that he's a specialist in urban and regional development. And since 1989, he has been dedicated to the study of disaster risk and climate change and its management. He has written more than 150 chapters, articles, documents, and scientific books on the topics of risk and disaster and urban development, besides so many impressive achievement and outstanding for these matters. Professor Alan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers and those attending this meeting for the opportunity to speak a little bit with a cold, so my voice is not as clear as it should be, but to be able to speak to you on this topic that in some way we can define as the problem of reducing or managing and avoiding what is commonly called disaster risk. Something interesting here in relationship to the other papers is that I'm dealing with a concrete social, economic, political, cultural, historical problem, which is increasing as time goes by. And the other speakers, very interestingly, have laid out many of the elements associated with the way to deal with this, along with other problems in the future. So mine is a problem-oriented talk, whereas those of Astrid and Paul and Brian, when he comes, and Hannah are looking at a lot of the mechanisms, instruments, strategies which can be used and should be used in order to get on top of a problem that is common. The problem we're looking at basically has this misnomer, very serious misnomer of natural disaster. Basically, what we're looking at is the erosion of development benefits, opportunities over time due to the occurrence of hazards which have been transformed into damaging events causing great loss and damage in society. And the type of events which are occurring, we delimit as external, which could be a little bit confusing in many ways, because many are really internal to society, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, biotic factors like COVID, flooding, etc., and drought. So that's basically what the central concern is. And the concern is the ability for us to be able to reduce the risk which leads to these types of damage and loss, or in some way avoid it in the future. And so when we talk about the capacity at a local level, I'm not going to get into what is local. It is definitely subnational. We will be talking about urban scales, local rural scales, etc. And where there is a governance or government structure which can take up on the challenge and get to it. The idea of capacity building, the other speakers have talked extensively about what that means in terms of knowledge, information, resources, investment, financing, so I won't go into any further detail. And one basic principle we're working on in order to look at this is the idea that disaster risk and consequently disaster is socially constructed. It is not a natural construct. What do we mean by this? This means that it is our actions collectively, individually, family-wise, governments, private sector, operating in a world where there are events which can cause damage and loss. It is basically our actions that lead to the risk, the magnitude, the type of risk which exists in society. And consequently, if we construct risk, we can deconstruct risk through a whole series of different activities. And we will be talking about 3 particular types of disaster risk management strategies. The first is what we call corrective disaster risk management, which is the risk is now on the ground. The hospitals and the schools and the houses are badly located and badly built, and we have to interrupt that process by reducing the risk that's already there correctively. Highly cost input, etc. Prospective relates to the fact that we can anticipate risk, and in some ways we can operate with different mechanisms which will avoid that risk is laid out on the ground in the future. This is far more economically viable and economically necessary. And we have compensatory risk management, which is what we do when the event is announced and it has happened, and we have to deal with response, reconstruction, rehabilitation, etc. So that is basically where we are. I'm going to deal more not with what we have to do because there isn't time, but basically why is this important? Why, from a local level and from a national and international level, do we need to consider the whole idea of disaster risk reduction complementary to disaster response? Firstly, and all of the data show this, and this has been obvious for many decades now, but without the adequate attention, we realize that risk is growing, constantly becoming more complex and more systemic in its effects, affecting areas that have not been directly affected, but to which are linked in some way economically, socially, with other areas of the same country or of other countries internationally. So risk is growing tremendously. We also realize that a good part of that risk is being concentrated in urban centres. Risk is increasingly urban as society is increasingly urban. We've now passed for 50%. Some areas are 80, 85, 90% urban. And a lot of the areas that aren't, like Africa, which is 47, 48, is growing and will be predominantly urban in the future. And most risk is concentrated in urban centres and most damage and loss. But one interesting point here is that it is not necessarily in the large metropolitan mega cities that risk and that damage and loss is expressed. It is more in cities under 1 million in size and many under 500, which are rapidly growing. And in the future, if we do not intervene in the problem of future disaster risk, we will be facing the same types of risk and levels that we face in the mega cities today. This is extremely important for Africa, which, as I say, is 48% urban now, projected to grow 1 billion in population in urban centres by 2050, double the amount of increased urban populations which has been experienced between 1990 and 2020. And interestingly enough, if you look at the growth rates of cities over the recent years, the greatest growth rates are, in fact, in cities that I have never heard of as not being an African specialist. And there are only 3 or 4 of the large metropolitan or large cities in the region which reach the 100% increase in urban populations over that time. So for Africa, urban risk in the future and local management of urban risk is going to be extremely important. And if we do not get on top of it before it is constructed, deconstructing it after will become almost impossible because of the economic costs and the financial layouts needed on engineering works to construct dikes, relocate population, and many other forms of corrective management. And so that brings me to the last point I'd like to make, without going into the details, is the insistence on what we call prospective disaster risk management strategies, and these being enacted, promoted, identified, supported at the local level with the resources they require. And here I'd make one very interesting point. The fact is that disaster, whether it is large-scale intensive or small-scale extensive and repetitive, is always experienced at the local level in terms of loss and damage. And the explanation is in the construction of vulnerability, exposure, and hazard manifestation at the local level. However, the local level does not control always the construction of the risk that it has to face. Much risk at a local level is constructed through national non-development policies, I would say, international policies. For instance, a very easy case is that the flooding of lower valley cities is many times caused by deforestation in the upper river basins. Many changes.
Professor Allen, one minute, please.
1 minute. And at an international level, changes in commodity prices can affect seriously risk patterns at a local level. So what we're going to have to do is introduce prospective risk management. And prospective risk management is based on existing development strategies and instruments. It isn't something invented by the disaster risk community, or shouldn't be. So basically, the principal instruments of prospective management is land use and territorial planning, environmental management, introducing in national investment decisions risk considerations, reduction of poverty and inequality. Consequently, I go back to the point I made just to finish, that the talks by my 3 predecessors and Brian after close in and on the idea of introducing disaster risk reduction into the DNA of development and not seeing it as a separate sectoral policy framework. Thank you very much indeed, and for the tolerance with time as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Alain Lavelle, for this presentation, which focused on the existing strategies to tackle and deal with the disaster risk. Also, the challenge to move from a reactive to proactive approach in disaster risk reduction. He also highlighted the fact that most risks are concentrated in the urban areas. He insists on the empowering of cities, localities, and communities, and building their capacities to effectively plan, mobilize, secure, finance, and control risks. And also, they are local government are often the victims of risks, which authors or initiators or national or central government. Now we have before I give the floor to Professor Brian, I would like to really wish a quick recovery both for Professor Allen and Tobago. Now we have our last speaker is Professor Brian Roberts, which
Najat, you are
Najat.
muted.
Sorry, colleagues. So I was saying that the message from Professor Brian will be through a video message. He's an international urban management expert, has held senior position with the United Nations Center for Human Settlements. He is a co-author of more than 100 publication and conference papers, including 10 books, with the contribution to the UN Habitat World Cities Development Report in 2011 and 2015. So please, if the video message is ready, can we share it in the screen? Yeah, great.
Hello everyone. Welcome to this short presentation on the strategy guidance notes on urban governance, prepared by the Committee of Experts on Public Administration. My name is Brian Roberts and I was one of the principal authors of this guidance note. I just want to spend a few minutes outlining the note and where you can get further information. I want to begin this presentation with a brief discussion on urban governance. Urban governance refers to how governments, in particular and stakeholders, decide how to plan and finance and manage urban areas. It's a continuous process. It involves a lot of contesting of the allocation of resources to different sectors of the economy. It's a very political process. However, it's no longer just the domain of governments. Increasingly, urban governance embraces engagement with business, civil society, and with international organisations, particularly when you're dealing with issues around climate change. The guidance note is presented under 6 sections. The first part develops our understanding of what urban governance strategy is from a historic to the current context. The second section looks at public sector situation with respect to the applications of urban governance, including broader applications involving public-private and community-based partnerships. The third looks at implementing urban governance strategy and provides some guidelines on this. 2 case studies are introduced, including references to many other case studies, peer-to-peer learning and research, and the final section looks at international development, cooperation and initiatives in the area of urban governance. There are many different stakeholders and other interests involved in urban governance strategies. These include state governments, local governments, civil society, central governments, international actors, and the informal sector. And depending on the nature of the strategy that's being formulated, be for a project or a program around urban development, urban management, the number of players involved will need to be considered very carefully. Urban governance strategy operates at many different levels and scales. At the local level, it may be concerned with a neighbourhood improvement scheme, how this is organised in partnerships between communities and local government. At the urban region, this will involve consultations with both local communities and with national governments, because there are issues of finance, laws, and other requirements to be taken into consideration. However, some elements of urban governance strategy will extend into the international sector. This may be in relation to dealing with UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the governance arrangements for that, and also how we localise the implementation of the SDGs. Urban governance strategy is complex and involves the integration of many different functions and societal interests. Urban governance strategies are required for many different purposes. Could be simply for integrated development plan for a region, or it could be for a national urban strategy. There are many types of urban governance strategies. All urban governance strategies end up with management arrangements which involve a composite of integrated and interrelated urban interests and responsibilities. The best way to approach the development and implementation of urban governance strategy is to use a systems approach, paying particular attention to multiple functions and responsibilities of agencies, organisations, and stakeholders and other party interests involved. There are 6 key urban governance strategy functions. These are shown in the left-hand column of the slide. More details about these are included in the policy note. It's important to link these functions to the organisations which are responsible for conducting various actions outlined in the strategy. It's also clear to outline the mandates and responsibilities of those organisations, such as the laws and regulations, the processes that are involved, and most importantly is to identify the capacities and capabilities and the resources needed to implement the governance strategy. The guidance note also includes some practical information. There are 2 case studies and a number of references to others on the web. The first case study looks at delivering metropolitan-wide business services in Verband-Stuttgart region of Germany. And the second is on governance arrangements for pooling metropolitan finance in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. There are a number of notes on peer-to-peer learning and research activities, including references to various institutions and organisations that have a key role in.
We are so sorry, Professor Brian, due to some constraints of time, but the video message will be shared with all the audience. So allow me now to express our sincere gratitude to all our honorable speakers for this insightful presentation, explanation, and sharing good practice from around the world. We have a few minutes to take some questions from the audience, and I think I have already 3. Let me share them with you. For Professor Paul Smok in Nepal, are you hearing me, Professor Paul?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes. So in Nepal, some of the political party politicians do not like provinces' institutions, and they think the provinces are useless, no work. What is your answer in federal system? Thank you.
Okay, well, that is a complicated question. And of course, one of the challenges in Nepal is that you switched to a federal system when you had a different system. And that involves processes of change and transition that I think maybe were not realized at the beginning. I mean, the big challenge in federal systems is to get the right balance between what the provinces or states or whatever the intermediate tier is called, and the right balance between them and the lower levels. The biggest challenge in some federations is that the state or regional governments have a lot of control over the resources that pass to the lower levels. That means that the cities and local governments tend to be very dependent on those intermediate tiers of government. I think that figuring out how to get that balance right is the biggest challenge in federal systems. And, you know, in the interest of time, I'd be happy to talk to you individually about it sometime. But I haven't worked in Nepal for a while and am not up to date on the current situation. So I think I better not say any more now. But again, happy to talk to you sometime.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul. The same question is going to Professor Anna, but before giving her the floor, please, dear participants, we will need to extend beyond the allocated time of our workshop. We are asking for your patience and flexibility. Professor Hannah, any reaction to the same question from Nepal?
So basically, how do we address an active dislike to the intermediate regional tier, or basically the perception that it's not useful? Am I summarizing this correctly, Madam Moderator?
Do you need me to repeat the question?
No, I was just summarizing the question. Was that summarized correctly?
Is the use of having provinces in Nepal, some party see that it's not necessary to have this level of governance.
Yeah. So yeah, I did summarize it correctly. Well, I think how you would address that question is to try and think about what is to be gained by the intermediate levels. What tasks are currently, if you allow me that expression, fall between the cracks? So what is not effectively addressed, and how could the regional level come in there? I mean, that is the functional perspective. There might be political reasons why there's this opposition to an intermediate tier, right? Is it the fear that it might create competition, or that it undermines some of the central government abilities to control policy? And those political considerations in opposition to the regional tier are much harder to address than, say, just pure concerns about whether this level is needed or adds to an efficient policy delivery. Without knowing much about the political context about Nepal, I can't say much more about that. But my hunch is always a mix of the two. So unless you can create political incentives for having an intermediate tier for people who want to make their career at an intermediate tier, and you have opposition, it's quite difficult to convince people of the usefulness of an intermediate regional tier. I hope that sort of addressed the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna. I have a question for Professor Alan Lavelle. In Ghana, Professor Alan, you're still with us? Okay. So the question is from Ghana. How can urban governance be integrated for effective marine spatial planning, as more attention has been given to land use planning for decades? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of the question. Could you repeat?
How can urban governance be integrated for effective marine spatial planning? It's about oceans. As more attention has been given to land use planning for decades.
Well, the integration of land and sea is absolutely fundamental for the majority of the large cities in the world. If we realize the number of cities that are located on seaboard for obvious reasons of resource availability in terms of transport integration, now globalization, then it should be clear that we have a need for an integrated land-sea approach. One example of this from the way past that I knew about, which is interesting to think about, was the whole policy of from ridge to reef, which was practiced in Jamaica over 25 years ago, whereby anything that was happening downstream was caused by things happening upstream. And things that happened downstream then increased the probability of hazards from the sea inwards and consequently affecting urban areas in terms of wave action or other things. What I can say here is that we need risk and exposure to hazard to be fully integrated into territorial planning and urban development schemes. If we could reduce exposure to disaster-related hazards, we would have no need for, although we would have need for, what is reduction of vulnerability, etc. If we could keep exposure limited, we would have solved a good part of the problem of disaster risk. Of course, that's not possible. And so territorial planning, urban planning has to be integrated with things such as building codes, building structure, limitations, etc. No, I'm not sure I answered the question, but anyway, I said something.
But there is, before moving again to Dr. Anna, we have another question for you, Professor Allen. It was in the chat, how we can use these tools about disaster risk reduction and climate change adoption as the vital tools for decentralization, sustainable development?
Well, I think at the end of my talk, I said the major instruments, strategies, tools for disaster risk reduction are those that have been proposed to promote efficient and efficacious development, sustainable development in general. There is a tendency to think that disaster risk reduction has its own series of instruments. And that is most surely true when it comes to corrective management, because you only build a dike to protect against flooding because there is flooding. Although you could use the dike for other social purposes, like cycling on top of it or whatever, which has been done in many places. But when it comes to prospective management, we really aren't talking about disaster risk reduction. What we're talking about is guaranteeing sustainability of development. And that means putting in land use planning principles that take into consideration hazards. Many don't. Many propose it and don't do it. You know, in Colombia, a case I know well, it is by law local municipalities, governments have to build in risk into their local development planning and spatial planning schemes. But only 200 of 1,080 actually do it. Why don't they do it? Because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the skills that allows to do it. And there are other more pressing problems apparently to be solved. Here we should realize that disaster risk is not a problem on its own. It is a problem for all other problems. And this is the problem of the holistic approach to planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. You have a participant from Jamaica, Miss Sabrina, who would love to speak with you, Professor Allen. So maybe it is in the chat.
I put my data in the chat for anybody who would like to get in touch.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Anna, we have another question for you. This is the question. I noticed in developing countries implementing decentralization at the municipal local level, there is the high risk of political dynasty that increases the risk of prolonged corruption practices. Any thought what the best way that this may be avoided, if not minimized, in implementing decentralization system? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question if we had the answer of how to address corruption and avoid political dynasties. So I will say that I try to get into this issue a little bit in the guidance note, specifically in the context of Latin America that experienced big decentralization forms in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And I used the case of Colombia to explain that a little bit. So I will just say a little bit what Colombia did, and hopefully that can illustrate this, what can be done, although it's by no means prescriptive or it fits all countries. And so they figured that the issue with corruption at the local level might be due to the revenues coming from the central level, but the expenditure being decided at the local level, right? So that it was easy for local government leaders to hand out goodies to the local population because the resources from that came from the central government. And so they have recently moved a little bit more towards increasing fiscal autonomy. And that seems very counterintuitive in that context where you have corruption and then you even increase autonomy more. But in the sense that the cost of corruption is localized then, right? So the local population bears the cost of corrupt practices. And the idea is that hopefully as a reaction, there will be more accountability as the local population is more concerned about how their taxes are spent, and that you have hopefully a closer tie at the local and regional level. And ideally kind of increase accountability, transparency, and make democracy at the local level work. That's not guaranteed to always work. This is, however, how the Colombian government reacted to that issue and how they, sort of the root cause where they perceive corruption to be coming from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna. The last question is for Professor Astrid. Please, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. So the question is, how do political economy dynamics, including key stakeholders, influence reform processes for local revenue generation through decentralization and the enhanced tax authority? And what are the successful cases and the drivers of such reforms in developing countries? We need another workshop.
That's a huge question. But let me just quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time, say, political economy is very key to reform processes and can enhance or derail reform process. And therefore, if you do engage in a reform process, as I was trying to say, stakeholder analysis, stakeholder communication is key. That being said, I think, there are a lot of reforms where political economy may play a role, but not as big a role. And these are administrative reforms. So reforms that can be done, let's say, at a local level of government without any need for approval from a higher level of government. And a lot of revenue can be generated just through administrative reform. So making systems more efficient, being able to digitize things. And so I would always encourage, particularly when you're starting reform processes, start with the low-hanging fruit, with the quick wins. Don't start with taking on the sort of big political pieces, because they can be long and they can be derailed, but there is still things that can be done in the meantime.
Thank you very much, Professor Astrid, for this clarification. I am very sorry, but I would love to give the floor to other participants from the audience, but we need to come to the end of our workshop. So allow me, honorable organizers, participants, guest speakers, just to highlight some key points I gathered from all the presentations. The first one is the concepts matters. So we need really to honor all these concepts we have in this workshop, like subsidiarity, like fiscal decentralization, multi-level governance, and so on. The national context matter. We cannot, in decentralization and subsidiarity, just copy and paste. There is common challenge in African context with specific other challenge. Crucial need for coordination, coherence, and cooperation between the different level of governance. Huge and important weaknesses, incapacities, resource mobilization, funding, and clear responsibilities between the different levels of governance. And we need a holistic, systematic, and strategic approach to implement decentralization based on subsidiarity. So thank you very much for your time, for your participation. And thank you again for the distinguished speakers, experts, and all of you for participating in this workshop. And I wish you the best to all of you in this holy month of Ramadan and beyond. And I give the floor back to Anna if she wants to make any announcement. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this such honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Najat, for your wonderful moderation. We are now at the end of the workshop. We apologize for the delay of the workshop, the extension. Now, please, gratefully, if you can use some time to complete the post-event survey. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye. Assalamu.